From the outset, we agree that fetuses might not be legal individuals who are subject to legal protections from harm in terms of full personhood. But we think that creating circumstances that will result in harm for a future person who does not yet exist should also be something that is considered illegal and is something that we should legislate to actively prevent against. What is our MEC? Firstly, we support laws that actively protect and enforce the health of fetuses and in terms of mothers that intend to carry them to term. Therefore, we disproportionately penalize activities such as smoking, taking hard drugs, and other risky behavior during the time of pregnancy. We think, and realistically, we think this will be true, the most common way this can be done is via the enforcement of civil suits, where a grown child can sue his mother or his parents in general for damages based on their behavior while he was still in the womb. However, at our best case, we are also happy to stand for criminal penalties too, applied with discretion in cases where there are severe mitigating factors. Like for instance, if you're in poverty and the only way you can get food is to work in a job that exposes you to asbestos, which creates an asymmetrically large risk of harm, we're happy to create that as a mitigating factor in this case. So we think that the primary method of enforcement will be civil suits, but we're happy to stand for criminal penalties as well. We're going to follow two broad strands of argument. First of all, in principle, that this is necessary to protect the lives of future persons. Secondly, that this changes the behavior of parents, particularly mothers, in the positive direction. First argument, that this is in principle necessary. We put to you that causing harm to an unborn fetus is in effect no different from damage you inflict upon a very young child. We think that we punish things like neglect, acts of abuse, or giving your child alcohol, for example, based on the harms to the child. But we don't punish these acts solely based on the facts that they traumatize children in that moment at which these harms happen, but also based on the cascading physical effects in the future. And we think that these are the important effects to focus on. We think that people, for example, can sue in proportion based on the damages that they suffer in their future life, based on how much they were developmentally damaged by their parents in their childhood. Here's the kicker, therefore. There is no qualitative difference between exposing your child to these harms when they are very, very young versus when they are in the womb. We think that even though they don't have legal personhood while they are in the womb, we think the cause of harm to future persons who do not yet exist when they exit the womb therefore justify this fact of protection. Yes?
How does your MEC of children doing this when they grow older and suing their parents make any sense when the best way to assess how a child was harmed almost always happens in the early stages after birth, thereby kind of eliminating this entire...
Obviously, if you suffer huge harms in early stages after birth, there might be cascading harms when you grow up as well. You know how damaged you are when you're a child, and we can have child protection services assess the extent of harm when you're young. So we're happy to make that in as well. It's not that important to debate. That's dealing with a very weak version of our case. So, in fact, we think that there are huge harms caused in this circumstance. Also note that we're not disproportionately pinning the blame on mothers here. We think that if fathers, for example, beat their wives and therefore cause their children to grow up with developmental disabilities or lack of capability, they can also equally be held to account because they have jeopardized the health of the fetus. So note that there can be positive actions implemented by the law in terms of fathers and their obligations to protect their children. This is not purely a policy that affects only one gender and therefore disproportionately targets women. So we put to you that there are huge amounts of qualitative harms that can happen to fetuses. In fact, scientific studies show that exposure to excessive nicotine in the womb can have far more long-term effects when exposed to than if it were exposed to a child when he's very young, for instance. So we know that the capacity for harm is very, very large, and therefore we think that in this case, parents should be held positively accountable. Now you might ask, then why do we allow abortion? Do we think that parents should be allowed to terminate pregnancy entirely? First of all, we put to you that there's a principal distinction between living a life of suffering or living a life with a large amount of suffering and never having existed at all. We think that non-existence is not necessarily a harm since there is no disutility or utility at all, whereas living life with some health problem that is quite serious and crippling can be considered quite a substantial degree of harm even though that life might be on the whole worth living. So we think that non-existence is not necessarily a harm, but inflicting damage on someone when they grow up is, and therefore there's a qualitative difference you make between abortion and the case of holding mothers accountable fathers accountable for health damages suffered to fetuses. But secondly, how do we positively change the behavior of parents in these circumstances? Well, thank you. So the first action that we think that we can implement in these cases is that parents will take more positive actions and positive steps to ensure that their children grow up well, like for example eating healthy, etc., etc. We think that these are things, not necessarily strong positive obligations, but we think that these are strong, we create like a strong legal incentive for parents to do this. But more than that, here's where I analyze the psychology of parents and why we make things better. First of all, we allow them to combat temporal biases. The psychology of many expectant mothers and fathers is to expect or to weight short-term gratification above and beyond long-term health considerations, both for themselves as well as their future child. Moreover, there's a degree of abstraction because, unfortunately, for most people, you're more likely to care about yourself than a future person whom you can only conceptualize in an abstract manner. Yes?
Okay, how does this make any sense when we're considering pregnant mothers who often undergo massive amounts of harm, and in any instance where they know that they could be doing harm to their child, almost always act differently? You're not actually getting these reckless mothers.
This assumes a very idealistic vision of parents. It assumes that A, they have perfect knowledge of the harms that they can be inflicting on their child, well. And B also assumes that they don't weight, like, for example, the need for short-term gratification instead of consuming cigarettes and alcohol. It's not clear, like the fact that parents, for example, can smoke and cause second-hand smoke to cause third-party harm to their children implies that parents don't necessarily put their child's interest to heart 100% all the time. So we think that we can combat and rectify these temporal biases, especially since, in the case where your baby is still in the womb, it's still particularly abstract to you. You don't tend to consider them in such great weight and in such great detail. Moreover, the fact that these harms will occur maybe 20 or 30 years in the future means these harms are very indeterminate to you. You think that just because you take alcohol or you smoke or you take drugs now, it doesn't necessarily causally definitely lead to harm in terms of the future growth of your infant or your child. So we help to rectify this temporal bias and this temporal abstraction of individuals. Secondly, and more trivially, we also combat ignorance. The fact is that many people are unaware of the health risks involved in many of the behavior that they're doing, and therefore we help them to internalize the damage that they're causing. And moreover, we change social norms regarding such risky behavior, especially in terms of parents who are expecting to have children. So we think that we positively change the behavior of parents in many beneficial ways in this case. Thirdly, we think that we agree that this might in some very marginal cases result in parents not being less willing to carry their children to term. We think firstly that this is highly unlikely because when abortion is available, as they mentioned, choosing to have a child is a deeply considered and deeply personal decision, therefore they're more likely to give up on the comparative drinking than like for example, sacrifice the health of your future child. What we are doing is to provide them a legal deterrent and a legal nudge in the right direction. But even if we take this argument at its best, and we assume that, for example, mothers or families in general are marginally more inclined towards abortion, we think, and maybe perhaps this intersects with certain communities, we think that might be acceptable because if these individuals are aborted and there are fewer individuals suffering from these health problems in the world, we create fewer people with these health problems in the future, which imposes a huge burden on constrained health resources, especially in disadvantaged or developing communities right now. That's an important problem. So there's a third-party harm angle in this debate as well. The fact that each additional child born with such crippling disability in the world also imposes huge resources on the infrastructure and the ability of health systems to care for third parties and other individuals. We're very proud to stand in opening government.
Okay, great. We'll have the leader of opposition, Kia.
It is the thesis of opening opposition that fetuses do not have legal claims, but even if they did, that passing laws that protect the lives of fetuses whose mother intend to carry to term both undermines the reproductive freedom of the mother and is ultimately counterproductive to protecting the health of the fetus itself. All rebuttal will be integrated. Firstly, at the top level, we do not think fetuses have a claim to legal protection. For one, they cannot feel pain. For another, they do not have moral agency, that is, if any pain that they experience is ephemeral, their ability to contextualize it or long-term damage is very nil. Now, the argument that we hear, specifically at opening government, is that inevitably anything that the mother does will impact the fetus down the line. Recognize this is true not just for the consumption of alcohol and tobacco, but true for pretty much any other kind of lifestyle change they take. That is, yeah, eating something unhealthy is very likely to have a negative impact on the fetus. It is unclear to me why literally any choice that the mother makes, short of being a perfect Puritan, would not therefore be grounds for legal standing to sue upon the mother, substantially making it such that no mother would be capable of actually bringing a child to term. But moreover, I actually don't buy their argument that there is a meaningful difference, no thank you, between non-existence and actually suffering pain. Because if there is no distinction, then things like contraception and abortion on their side house become morally unconscionable, because it means that people literally cannot even exist. What is their warrant for why non-existence? It doesn't matter, except an intuition trigger. Rather, the fact that non-existence means that you are principally denied any ability of experiencing all the joys that life has worth living. Therefore, if you use contraception, it means your ability to live is non-existent, and everything over the course of 90 years worth of joyous existence cannot happen. That becomes unconscionable if something that happens in the future to someone who does not yet born is something that is morally matters. But no thank you. What actually matters then? We think that people are not likely to seek help for any harms that happen if you have these laws that allow civil standing 25 years later. Why? Their argument that they present is that this is going to change the behavior of mothers who are less likely to drink alcohol or harm the fetus. But here's the problem. No mother intends to harm the child. If there's someone who intends to carry the child to term, this is someone who generally deeply cares about the child's living. These are people who are deeply invested, whether hormonally or it's the nature of the human condition, to care about their child. threat of litigation 25 years down the line is not going to change their behavior. It's not like, oh, I didn't really care about this child, but man, if I'm going to get sued when I'm 50, now that changes my decision to drink alcohol. Rather, who are the kinds of women or people who tend to make these kinds of decisions that are counterproductive for the life of the child? Generally, either it's out of ignorance, at which point the threat of litigation is very unlikely to change it, or it's out of impulsion. That is, there's something about addiction or their inability to resist peer pressure or other kind of external forces. The people who face those kinds of addiction or impulsiveness are precisely not the kinds of people who are likely to respond to the threat of litigation 25 years down the line. The ability to contextualize this is very low. I genuinely think deterrence in other kinds of suits is relatively weak. The severity of punishment is very weak determinant of punishment. Rather, most criminological evidence suggests its certainty of punishment, which, to be clear, is very unlikely to be high, particularly in the most disadvantaged community where they're less likely to sue. This means that they're not likely to respond to these things. Moreover, proving causality 25 years down the line is very unlikely to meet the standard to pass a civil suit. So what then is the marginal change? If women credibly believe that they are going to face a civil suit 25 years down the line for a mistake that they made, which recognize that they're likely to make this mistake not consciously knowing that or intending to cause harm, they are not going to seek help for the problem. That is, people who are facing addiction or making bad decisions such as regularly drinking alcohol during the first 3 months of pregnancy, perhaps before even knowing that they were pregnant themselves, are not going to seek help for that problem or seek other forms of treatment, knowing that the omission of that is very likely to result in them facing civil suit. The fact is, if you drink alcohol, 1 second for back half, for, say, the first 3 months, you probably are going to get away if you never admit it. Child will never be able to win in court 25 years down the line, which means you're never going to seek help to actually protect the life of the fetus.
Would you legislate against harm against 1-month-olds who have very limited sentence, or people who are so developmentally disabled that they aren't able to feel pain to the same extent as others?
I think there are strong reasons why we extend protection to 1-month-olds based on civil standards of what we consider to be acceptable in society, based on cultural standards, and also about inculcating some kind of decency. But no, I don't understand what the full, catching me in a logical trap does not prove anything about the actual implications of this policy. So what does it matter then? We actually care about protecting the lives of these fetuses if we believe that they have rights, which is the opening government's best ground. In that case then, if women are less likely to seek help because they're less likely to admit it, this means that the actual meaningful lives of these fetuses, once they are born, is so much worse. This is why, for example, the criminalization of the transmission of HIV has probably done enormous harms for actually protecting communities who are most likely to be victimized, because it means that people literally do not get tested for the first place, because if they get tested, then they are likely to be criminally liable. They ultimately harm their own cause. But secondly, we think this undermines reproductive freedom for women. That is, if the fetus is recognized as worthy of legal protection, there are two ways in which this harms reproductive freedom. One, in many states that are common law, that is, if the fetus is someone who can be legally recognized to be a person, it's not a full legal person, but someone worthy of legal protection, this is the same kind of precedent to be involved in, say, restricting it, maybe abortion at 22 weeks once the fetus can feel pain. But secondly, the same political rationale, that is, if we consider the fetus to be a morally relevant thing, then this becomes a very effective argument for people to latch on to ban abortion. Actually, I'll take one from the front half before I get to the end half.
So, we agree that there are some cases of harm that are indeterminate, but in clear cases, like for example, giving your child alcohol, we do legislate for children that there are certain lines that parents can't cross. Why can't we do the same for fetuses?
The reason why is because it makes it less likely. The ability to draw causality is lower, especially because it's very unlikely, or whether these problems are a result of fetal alcohol syndrome or relatively anything else, and the result being that they're less likely to get tested or actually admitted or seek help. I think if states are making decisions based on what is actually going to be effective, this is a fairly reasonable thing. I think the analogy to HIV transmission is very apt. But what is the impact then about undermining reproductive freedom? I think 3 ways to weigh this. One, we think the right of the woman to have control over their own body comes prior to the right of the fetus. That is, their ability to say, I do not want to carry this child to term, I do not want to be forced into compelled labor and to do anything else, is so much more important than any kind of potential claim that the fetus, which apparently non-existence, is something that is not a harm. In that kind of case, they're not actually causing a harm to anyone by determining the rights. But in these same political arguments, both in the legal and the political domain, make it far harder for them to exercise to do so. But secondly, it makes abortion just so much riskier. That is, if you ban abortion or substantially restrict it, like many states like Arkansas or Louisiana are trying to do, using the same political logic that about protecting future lives or protecting future harms, this means that women are very likely to seek abortion in increasingly dangerous ways. You're not actually accomplishing your goal of protecting lives of fetus. All you're doing is dramatically escalating the risks for the women themselves. In this case, that is deeply counterproductive to introduce into the legal and political sphere arguments that recognize that fetuses have moral claims and that they have claims upon the people who they will soon become. I think this is a very dangerous precedent that is very likely to harm the fetus and the mother themselves, could not be harder to oppose.
Next to the leader, we'll have the Deputy Prime Minister, Keka.
Two things. First, on the principle. Second, on the changes that will actually happen as a result of this policy. Not only in the behavior of individual mothers, but also in the way that society treats them and like the way that laws are structured around possible lives of unborn fetuses. First, some rebuttal on this. They say that fetuses cannot feel pain. A, this applies to very, very young kids too. But B, that they have harms along the line. So our claim is that conditional on them being born, that is the decision to have to make them born, there is pain to them. So like this is actually true of all pain that people feel, because they do not feel pain like directly at the instant of being harmed. But in many cases, for kids, for instance, in terms of parents' responsibility to kids, it happens, I don't know, when they feel the effect of not being sent to school earlier on, or when they do not get help by their parents. But finally, then when they say that you cannot draw a line here between, I don't know, giving a child fast food. We do this all the time in terms of children's rights. So for instance, giving a child fast food versus giving a toddler cigarettes or alcohol, we know that these are all bad things for toddlers, but certain things are very, very bad to the extent that we have a principled justification for making them a criminal thing. We see there's a direct analogy between giving a child alcohol to, as a mother, deciding to have alcohol, knowing that that will go into the bloodstream of your unborn child. Then they say that non-existence does not matter. The point in this debate is that it is post-existence. That is, your decision to take this child and like give birth to this child means that you have actually materially harmed that child in their life because they have a much worse quality of life than they otherwise would have been. Notice that non-existence is not a harm. So if people decide to additionally abort these children, that is not morally problematic. Since if non-existence were a moral harm, I don't know, we would have a duty just to procreate all the time in order to have the maximum number of kids and deny the maximum amount of non-existence. But we think that you are deciding to harm a new human in this case. This also responds to the abortion thing, because they say that abortion is riskier, but there's a philosophical distinction between abortion and between doing this. In fact, it's specifically empowering because it means that mothers are allowed to abort instead of doing this thing. So some more principled analysis. I'll take you first.
Okay, the problem is that your punishment and a lot of your analysis relies on the notion that by punishing women, you will make them act differently and give them some kind of information. But punishment is not a nutrition seminar. You don't actually solve information asymmetry on your side of the house.
I also think that punishments should be for things that are morally bad, regardless of whether behavior changes or whatever. So for instance, even if it were not like an effective punishment, I would still punish mothers for giving their children, very young children, alcohol, knowing that it will destroy their children's lives in the future, for instance. So we think that this is like a principled imperative as well. I'm going to talk about the practical stuff later, but I'd just like to add a couple more things on the principle first. Firstly, notice that a lot of things that we care about morally right now are predicated on harm to future persons, but not harm to current people. So for instance, a lot of the justification for sustainability and stopping climate change is predicated on harm that will happen far down the line rather than harm that is right now. And notice that this is contingent upon births of future people happening. So for instance, even if, like if I decide to bury a bomb right now, and it will go off in 150 years, so no one who lives right now will be affected by this bomb, and therefore people in the future will be contingent on, like, people deciding to give birth to these people. This is still a morally wrong thing for me to decide to do. And also, because the earth is chaotic, maybe my decision of burying this bomb means that different people will live. Secondly, notice that parents explicitly make a decision to have kids in this case. But thirdly, notice that these kids are defenseless, therefore they need this legal system to protect them and defend them in this case. Also, Arthur adds an argument about third-party harms in terms of cost to healthcare, additional cost to healthcare, unresponded to. Then, just to preempt some stuff about unfortunate circumstances of their parents. Notice that firstly, this is intentional, but secondly, notice that we can help people who are in unfortunate circumstances, and therefore the kids have like a lower quality of life in terms of regulatory systems. But also, we think that it's still wrong, even if you have fewer options to decide to addict your kids to drugs, or decide to do things that will massively, massively hurt your kids' quality of life. What are the changes that we actually get here? Notice, when we're thinking about the changes to this policy might implement, notice that we're talking about mothers rather than criminals. So the stuff that opening opposition tells us about not changing behavior because your probability of going to jail is relatively lower actually affects a relatively small amount of this debate. The important thing is that we have a massive social suasion telling people that this is actually a principally wrong thing by the state. Like, mothers generally care about their children, but maybe this is not something that they think about as morally pressing. And they don't think about it as morally pressing because they might go to prison, but they think about it as morally pressing because the state says this is an important enough thing that you would go to prison. So it's the sort of thing that you might get judged for within the home, for instance. You get a ton of more moral suasion on this. So then we get a POI saying how this happens very late. Arthur says we can do it after birth too, so that takes out this offense and also the stuff that LO says about having a later penalty. But also notice that you can often still tell whether these things are caused later in terms of medical records, for instance. What is the stuff that Arthur tells you about why people systematically underevaluate this? A, because of abstraction. B, because it's very far in the future. And C, because some people are just ignorant. We now combat this ignorance by having a massive law about it, which means that it's very high profile. Therefore, people will start to know about these changes. Yeah.
Are people genuinely ignorant that using drugs while being pregnant or using alcohol while being pregnant is a bad idea? It literally says on the alcohol label.
I think perhaps people do not know the extent to which things are bad. So which is the reason that, I don't know, maybe people think it's fine to eat fast food while pregnant, but not and therefore to have alcohol while pregnant as well, which is a very thing that the leader of the opposition was trying to make as a moral distinction. We think that given this like blurry thing, for the state to actually say this is so many times worse that we can actually make it criminal means that you actually change it in this sense. Finally, I'd like to add on this claim that it is very important that the structure of society around unborn fetuses currently does not prioritize their well-being, and if we make this a case, it will start to prioritize their well-being. So for instance, it might become illegal for the people to give mothers who are intending to have unborn children things like the access to drugs, for instance, or like a very late pregnant mother's access to alcohol. Or notice that the EZ pass tolls in the USA were justified on the grounds that they were causing harms to expectant mothers who lived in communities nearby. Therefore, we think that if we enshrine the harms to expectant mothers within the legal system, it's more likely that we can societally change the structure of society such that they are helped. Some more responses to the stuff that the leader of the opposition said. About a later penalty, notice that we can have a very high-profile laws, and we can do this earlier and right away too. But also notice that in general, people do not want to do illegal things if they care about their kids enough that they want to help them. So the question is, how does the government draw lines and use its moral suasion to demarcate authority in this sense? Then they say that mothers will not seek help. I've already responded to this in the analysis about how mothers care about their kids, and therefore they are more likely to know about this. But also notice that if we can create a societal norm to give mothers more help about these issues, that is, we say that it is so pressing an issue that it becomes a criminal thing, people are much more likely to pressure mothers into going up and getting help with these things. I'm proud to propose.
Okay, great. We thank the that was the DPM, right? That kind of thing. We'll have the deputy leader of opposition here.
Panel, our thesis in this round has been extremely simple. That is to say, letting the government into legislating what happens within women's bodies is a golden ticket to shut the door permanently and legislate those rights away forever. This is an extremely large impact that I think they needed to deal with much more substantially. But before I get into that, I'm going to talk about their policy and why I just do not think a priori it's likely to be successful in the first place, before I talk about how this is going to harm reproductive rights at large and just general policies towards fetuses in the negative. Let's talk about their policy and why I don't think it works. Let's quickly deal with the philosophy here. Because note, all of the responses to our stuff about how appeals to future people are just insanely nebulous and as such not legitimate cause for legislation are just appeals to example. It's like if I bury a bomb and I know people are going to live on top of that bomb, it's thus illegal. But this is all contingent on efficacy. They try to say in the DPM that, oh, we would do something and punish something just because it's bad, but this clearly flies in the face of our intuitions. We don't believe in punishing something that's bad if that punishment causes more bad outcomes, which is the thrust of Will's argument in dealing with the policy. Why is it likely this policy is only going to create worse outcomes, even if we think we should care about these nebulous future people? So, look, who do you think in today's world is smoking cigarettes or drinking to excess when they are pregnant? There's two cases here. One, people who don't know they're pregnant yet, or 2, people who are so addicted that they can't stop consuming the substance. Because look, they can say, the law is such a meaningful tipping point and people don't care about the medical warnings on bottles of booze. I just think this is unreasonable. People know about the harms, and just saying, oh, people still eat fast food, so clearly they don't internalize the harms. For their own reasoning, it's a degree of harm which is substantially worse from consuming these substances. So who are the people who are doing it? It's what Will told you and they didn't want to engage with. It's addicts, it's people who are negligent, and it's people who don't know. What's the harm to criminalizing this action for those 3? They never get help. That's to say, a lot of addicted mothers don't try to go to rehab before their child is born because they're afraid they're going to go to jail or suffer some harsh penalty that would need to be in place for their policy to be effective. This means people who don't realize that they've done something very bad in the first 2 months of their pregnancy never go and seek harm for it because they were negligent but can't do something to seek recourse, so they hide it. They might say their kid's going to sue them, but look, what's going to happen then? It's like, 1, it's an extremely uncertain punishment at the point which it's 18 years of waiting, so the mother doesn't think that you might be penalized because of it, because a lot can change in 18 years, we could all be dead by then. But 2, the point which is fractures families along the lines of the children and their maternal relationships. This is also an extremely negative impact, even if they get advocacy. Close it.
Okay, so mothers will presumably have to go to the hospital at some point, either for personal care or for the birth of your child. That means that they will be detected at some point, so there is no deterrent to not accessing care because they will be found out eventually anyways.
But these things can't be traced back to individual harms like directly, right? Like if a fetus is born with birth defects, you don't know if it was because of drinking alcohol or if it's just an exogenous like birth defect. Like these things can't be perfectly traced back, and I just don't think this is the case. So at that point, you incentivize women to hide it, or at the least to not get treatment for another few months. Like seriously, this is a substantial harm to some of society's most vulnerable. Even not in this case, there's people who don't know they're pregnant, again, who don't have any incentives to do something once they find out they're pregnant, which is an extremely bad harm to those people themselves. Look, the example about HIV transmission, I think, was an extremely salient one this round, at the point which criminalizing that made it so much harder to actually get people to go and get medical assistance because they feared retribution. This is not the way to solve this problem. I think the status quo is solving it excellently, and they should have contested with that a lot more. Let's be clear about what this does in the round then, because I just do think that a lot of their philosophy falls down on the path contingency of proving this works. This is not like to sway people if those people are addicted, negligent, or literally just don't know they're pregnant. That's the use case for this debate, and I do not think that they proved it works for them. Because again, their reasons are kind of weak at the point which they're just like, you abstract long-run harms and you don't know. It's like, no, if you care about the child, because remember, they all chose not to abort them, so clearly they're caring about the child in this instance. They're going to be taking steps to make sure the child isn't in danger. So at that point, again, who does the law affect? People who cannot meaningfully choose to not do something they know is harmful to the woman. Because again, like, even if they don't think current information is effective, we're fine beefing up information and making sure everyone knows about the harms, but we're not fine doing a policy which makes no one willing to come forward because they fear retribution for doing something which they can't meaningfully choose to not do. I'm gonna start the second thing, I'll take you guys in about a minute. Second, this is going to roll back reproductive rights for women. Because again, this just proves that their policy makes this substantially worse, the first half of the speech. Because the people who it meaningfully affects are people who then do not get treatment and thus have worse lives, fractured families in the best case, and kids who are probably going to be born with defects that shouldn't have been born in the first place. But second, this is going to be used as a cause to roll back reproductive rights. Why? For 2 reasons. In virtually every legal system you can imagine, this policy serves as precedent or cause to extend protections for fetus to them being killed. They're just like, non-existence isn't a harm. Okay, you guys tried to make us defend infanticide. To be very clear, theirs is the side which needs to defend that, at the point which it's extremely unclear why they're not okay with killing babies as soon as they're born, because they don't have quality of experience and they can be killed as soon as they're outside of the womb. At that point, we're fine with not making infanticide okay, because to the extent that our policy isn't the one saying harms to fetuses in the womb is bad, we don't have to defend that. What does this mean then? Their side is governments, which can either on a precedential basis by saying, look, we've extended protections to fetuses when they're already in the womb. We should probably protect them from being killed, because most rational society, even if debaters in this room, think that being killed is a harm that people should be protected against. So for this reason, they're likely to legislate it. It's just like pretty clear cut. I don't think the non-existence thing makes a lot of sense. Opening.
Okay, so would you not criminalize domestic abuse of any kind because your parent or your partner can beat you up and deter you from going to the doctor?
What? No, but like the victim can go forward and be like, I got hurt. Like in this case, it's about the mother getting recourse for herself when she's addicted. Like this is clearly not at all a parallel case. Okay, So that's like why this is likely to be used to roll back reproductive rights. I think it's like very clearly like the philosophical successor to it. Why is this bad? 3 things they should have engaged with. Outside of the psychological harms, the most important one is the fact that lots of people who then do not want to have their child need to seek illicit abortions. And this means that they are subject to extreme medical harms, and the abortions might just literally kill them in the first place. This is far more dangerous. Even if those things don't happen because their side does not have like abortions which are extremely dangerous replace legal abortions, once this policy is used to legitimate bans on abortions, this just means lots of mothers who would have not had their child in the first place have that child, which begs the question as to how good a life that's going to be. Maybe they didn't have the money for a child. Maybe they just weren't ready for one. Resentment, or at least lack of means, is likely to pursue those children once they're born. These are not good lives, and I think that the small percentage chance, even if it's small, that reproductive rights are rolled back on their side is a massive impact they need to contest. For that reason, we're proud to oppose.
Alright, we'll have the member come, Chair Hill.
Panel, we think that the choices of women are paramount and ought to be respected most in this debate. However, we think that once someone makes a choice to bring a future being into this world, a future being who can feel substantial pain and substantial harm, that choice, while it ought to be legitimised and respected, does come with reciprocal responsibilities, namely to not place that future person into a poison box for 9 months, a poison box which they cannot consent to entering into and which will cause them potentially a life of agony. But secondly, we think it's important to recognise that pregnant women are often extremely vulnerable. That as a result of them making a choice to carry their baby to term, they face discrimination, they face harm, they often face violence and pressure to have abortions. And so we think it's necessary and legitimate that states protect the rights of pregnant women and give them this extra means of legal recourse. I want to do 3 things in this speech. Firstly, I want to clash directly with the opening opposition, explain why we think these laws actually are beneficial for the pro-choice movement, both on a theoretical but also a practical level. Secondly, I want to do a little bit more work on how we can protect future children, and finally how we can protect pregnant women. Let's jump straight into this, because essentially a large chunk of the opening opposition case is a slippery slope argument. That once we pass a law which protects unborn fetuses which are going to be born, the automatic result is that pro-lifers will suddenly sweep the board. I'm going to be very clear what our stance is. This is ultimately a question of weighing up rights. We think a fetus does have enough of a moral claim to punish someone external to the mother who causes it harm. A fetus does have enough of a moral claim to punish a mother who knowingly brings it into existence and brings it into a terrible and painful existence. A fetus, however, does not have sufficient moral weight to demand that a mother carries it to term. Right? So we can ultimately reconcile the rights of a fetus which will be born, while at the same time saying that that fetus does not have the right to force that person to exist for 9 months. We think the analogy would be this. As a human being, I have a right for that means Jason cannot kill me. That right doesn't extend to me demanding survival by hooking myself up to Jason for 9 months. That's how we can reconcile those 2 positions. So that's why theoretically this policy is perfectly in keeping with pro-choice positions. But I want to note that it goes further than that, and it's actually positive in terms of the pro-choice movement. Why? Firstly, I don't want to get overly concerned over mechanisms, right? But this law presupposes, by saying that this only applies to fetuses who would have been born, that a mother and a woman has the ultimate choice. That it is the choice of the woman which generates the value to the fetus. That ultimately is the most important thing which needs to be respected. And we think that actually this stance is probably more in keeping with social norms and can consequently mean more people turn towards pro-choice positions. Because when pro-choice activists essentially dismiss fetuses as having no moral worth whatsoever, that can often be deeply alienating to more moderates who then turn to pro-life views because they think that pro-choice advocates are simply being unreasonable. On our side of the house, we have a more nuanced position. We think that's more likely to win moderate support, so boosts pro-choice causes overall. Opening.
Slippery slope's like pretty uncharitable. Look, in many countries where abortion is already legal, there are heated movements to abolish the movement from the pro-life, just like people in general. One decision which says the state can legitimately protect the rights of the fetus is all that's necessary in, say, a common law state to set precedent so the highest court can ban abortion. This is a huge impact.
Sure. The difference is that the pro-life position is that from the moment of conception, a fetus has value. This is very different because it says that the fetus only has value because it is certain to come into existence. I think it's just illegitimate to say that this is going to particularly support the pro-life movement, given that it's already at sort of 100% operational capacity, given how important pro-lifers think this is. Moving on. Why do we think that this is a morally legitimate and necessary thing to do? Crucially, I want to note this, that although fetuses cannot feel pain at the moment, the reality is that if we don't intervene to protect the rights of fetuses that will come into existence, we essentially as a state condemn future individuals to a life of significant harm and significant pain. The analogy is this: if I fill a room with poison gas, even if that room is empty at the present moment, if I know that someone will enter that room and suffer harms as a result of it, it's still an immoral action to do. We say that if you know that a fetus will come into existence, we ought to treat it as a person. And this is why Jason's POI, about why we still grant rights to those who are mentally incapacitated, is really important, because we say that because something will come into existence and will have some degree of humanity, it ought to be protected. The response we get from opening opposition to this is twofold. One, almost anything could be harmful, and two, this will practically harm the health of fetuses. I think obviously we are only going to prosecute mothers who are egregiously neglectful, right? In the same way that we don't take children away from every single parent who is bad, we only take children away from parents who are extremely neglectful. The reason why this is likely to be successful is not just that it deters people from behaving recklessly while they are pregnant, but it also gives social services the ability to intervene proactively. Right, so that when they see someone behaving in a very dangerous fashion to their fetus, they now have legal way to immediately intervene with that person, to give them warnings about their future conduct, potentially pressure them into going into rehab, and consequently we fulfill our obligations to the fetus. Go.
If we assume the best possible mechanism from opening government, where this does actually encourage women and families to better treat fetuses while they're in pregnancy, do you not think that logically that would also encourage women who absolutely otherwise would not have gotten abortions to get abortions in situations that they would have never chosen to on their own?
No, we think probably what's more likely is that you will get preemptive intervention that protects the rights of fetuses. And in any case, we think that the harm of being somewhat pressured into an abortion, if the alternative is that you live in such an unhealthy way that you will cause a child to be created, well, that's ultimately a pressure we are willing to apply. We think the harm of having to have an abortion rather than behave in a way that will cause a child to exist in a huge amount of pain is one that we are ultimately willing to absorb on our side of the house. Finally, we would argue that this motion is necessary in order to protect women who are pregnant from being harmed at work. What this looks like is that employers can often force pregnant women to engage in dangerous activity. They can often fire them. And under the status quo, those women have very little means of legal recourse from this. On our side of the house, if an employer forces a pregnant woman to work for longer and consequently forces her into a miscarriage, she now has the ability to use legal recourses to help her and gain restitution for the emotional harm this causes. And ultimately, this motion best validates the choices of women and best protects future people. Very proud to propose.
Okay, fantastic. We thank the member of government. We'll have the member of opposition here.
two main extensions. One, a retroactive application that forces women to choose abortion, and two, the choice of these women, which is quite limited in most circumstances, and how that leads to a lack of culpability on the behalf of the woman. But before that, explicit refutation. First of all, I think that this model is just like quite ineffective, right? Their idea is that, well, in status quo, expose children to certain harms, such as like giving them alcohol when they're kids, and then you are like unfit parents and blah, blah, blah. I think in status quo, when horrible parenting does happen, the state has the power to stop that somehow, intervene somehow. But their mechanism is only relying on the kid in the future, 20 years from now, to like actually sue their parents, right? So I think that just like fundamentally diminishes any type of efficacy, because like parents' calculation, like first of all, like I think people like right now there are laws that are saying that people, you know, will go to jail if they commit a certain criminal act, like right now. Even those laws have failed to determine a lot of people. And I think that you're asking people, like parents, to consider like what's going to happen 20 years from now, and they're considering the possibility of a child actually suing them, who are the people that are going to be raising them. I think that that's just like a huge ask. It's probably not going to happen. But second, I want to engage with this idea that you know, it's better to have abortion than bring a child into the world if you cannot give the child the best life. I think that this principle is quite problematic. I think that by this logic, you would also be saying women who are poor, women who are single mother, who cannot provide the best circumstances for their children growing up, should also not give birth to their kids. I think that is very problematic. I think the reason why is that like a child is not deserving of a certain life, of the best circumstance. I think what happens is that like, yes, like to some degree, like everyone suffers some kind of defect, some kind of circumstantial factors that prevent them from like living the best life that they want to be, right? But that does not mean their life is not worth living. And I also think that this is just like a fundamental infringement on women's ability to choose, and assuming that the choice and well-being of the woman is less important than this like future child to be. I don't think that's necessarily the case. Last piece of refutation, this is more targeted towards CG, right? The idea that, oh, you enshrine the choice of woman because by like boosting support for pre-choice because the motion says something about choice. I think that this is like literally holding women to a one-time choice for the rest of their pregnancy and the rest of their life. It's saying if you make this choice at this one point, then in the future you can't regret it. We're going to police your behaviors based on the choice you made previously. I think a lot of people regret their choices they made not a long time ago, and I don't see how in this situation that's necessarily a valid principle. I'll take front hand.
Again, with much of criminal law in general, many actions are irreversible and they have long-term harm. So while we can use poverty as a mitigating factor, it doesn't negate the fact that these actions have moral consequences.
Okay, I'm going to talk about the structural factors and how women are limited in terms of their choices, and I think that that can be solved by just saying there's like mitigating factors, right? Okay, so I think largely women who intend to have babies, who want to have babies, they largely try their best to not harm their fetuses. That is to say that they have tried their best, to the degree possible to avoid harm. And now what you are doing is to say that the lifestyle choices, the things like addiction, are necessarily something they need to be held accountable for. And I think that this disproportionately affects women that are unable to opt out of that particular lifestyle. Because I think quite often, say addiction is for genetic reasons. That's not something you have control over. But we're also talking about a ton of other cases. We're talking about asymmetry of information. When if you're less educated, if you live in rural areas, maybe you do not have the perfect information about how nutritional facts work and how to best provide how to help your fetus develop healthy in a healthy manner. And I also think that quite often not intending abortion does not mean intending to bear a child and intending to raise a child. Why is that the case? I think a lot of times women who are, especially women who are overweight, right? Women who who can't figure out that they are pregnant until pretty late during the term, and it's no longer possible for them to get abortion at that point. I don't think how that's a valid choice, how you can put that choice on these women. But we're also talking about a woman who just lack access to abortion. They want to talk about cases where abortion already exists. I think that even though abortion is allowed in many places, does not mean that there are clinics. There's a ton of restrictions in terms of how women can access abortions. That's just I think they're only contending the best case possible. But also, I think that quite often there are women who, because of religious convictions and like reasons as such, they just won't get abortions even though they got pregnant without intending to have a child. I think all these reasons, all these factors just mean quite often, for structural reasons, that women are not necessarily opting into that choice and opting into harming a child. Before I move on to the other piece, I want to take a POI from back up. Okay, yeah, whatever. Okay, retroactive application. Recognize the best case scenario, or any case that's possible that can be set by the government, is necessarily retroactive. That is to say that this only happens after women have had a bad lifestyle that have caused harm to their children. I think that just means that you are pushing women after realizing that they've consumed alcohol or they've consumed drugs for these pushing them to get abortion, because assuming that they do achieve the efficacy they want, they do achieve the efficacy where women are effectively deterred. It necessarily means that women have to get abortion. And what's the bad impact of that?
Your case talks about a narrow set of circumstances, but our case also protects fetuses when other people intervene, like employers who are negligent, or individuals who assault a woman and thus inevitably hurt that fetus as well. Please engage with those cases as well, where we certainly win with the mother's will.
Okay, I'm not sure how employers hurt fetuses, but I do think that we are talking about the cases that are most common, that are going to be most affected by this, right? Broadly speaking, I think yes, a lot of women who have access to abortion, who are perfectly informed about this, are just not going to be affected by this. And I think that the cases that do matter are the cases that I talked to you about. Retroactive application, right? Recognize that when you force women to undergo abortion, that's not just bad because it's against their choice, but it's also bad because imposes a lot of emotional and psychological effect on women. That's telling them that not only have they killed the fetus, but tell them that they need to internalize the blame for having that abortion. Or the alternative is having the possibility of some years somewhere down the road having to pay a huge civil fine to it, right? Honorable Speaker, I think women are the most important factor in this case, and we're happy to say on CO, we're better able to not coerce women into make choices they wouldn't have otherwise made. I'm so proud to oppose.
Awesome. Thanks, Demo. We'll have the final speech on the gut bench. Go with.
We agree that the will of women is valuable and important, but the claim that came from closing government was very simple, that after the 3-month period in which you could have that abortion, you have made a commitment to that child, in the same meaningful way in which a parent has meaningfully made a commitment to a child that they have chosen to raise and not put up for adoption. And in that same sense, you have obliged yourself to ensure that you take care of that child responsibly. Our case is not to say that we would coerce people into these decisions, but these are meaningful decisions that people make. I think it's implausible for them to say that in that 3-month period you did not know that you had a child. It is implausible for them to say that in the vast majority of circumstances you didn't have genuine will. And we think that commitment that you make creates a genuine moral connection between the two actors, which obliges them. 3 different questions in this debate. First of all, does this actually change the behavior of people to improve the lives of fetuses? Second of all, how does this affect women's rights and whether or not this is good for them? And lastly, on whether or not fetuses have a legal claim to life and should deserve protection. First, I want to quickly deal with the argument of the behavior of people. I want to deal with the OG argument that comes out because I think this is an attack on the mechanism. This is also where we're definitely going to beat the open government team. Their claim here is that mothers will have no incentive to go get treatments for the fetus. A host of responses here. Number 1, the vast majority of circumstances where you think this treatment will occur is when a husband or someone else notices the fact that that mother is drinking too much or smoking heavily and that they can get pre-intervention. This is how the vast majority of rehabilitation happens in the status quo for addictions, where other people intervene, and when there's now a criminal sanction or a criminal ability to intervene, that means that they have capacity to get preemptive services. No thank you. Something that KIT tells you, which is incredibly valuable, that social services are now able to intervene in the fact and they're able to get rehabilitation for that mother. The second thing that I want to observe is that mothers oftentimes do need to get personal care during the time of their pregnancy, or that they do need to go to hospitals for the birth of that child, and after that child is born, they have to do regular checkups with doctors as an obligation. These are all different ways in which you get sufficient data to be able to extrapolate the fact that these children might have had FASD. And furthermore, in a world in which it is criminalized, that means that a moment in which a child is born with a developmental disorder, they'll probably keep them longer for assessments and try and figure it out. So that mechanistic problem they identify is incorrect. Third of all, if they genuinely believe that mothers care about their children so much and love them so much, I think that they're willing to bear this cost, especially given that a lot of the OO cases that this is a distant cost that people won't calculate into their decisions because it is so minimal and so far in the future. If that is the case, that means that the vast majority of mothers would care about the short-term health of that child versus the speculative harm that they themselves concede might not work in the long run, but we still get the benefits of preemptive care, no thank you, and we still ensure that they get treated in that time. The fourth and final thing that I want to note is that this fails to meet all the cases that Kit talks about, where you have intervention about other people. For instance, when employers put you in dangerous working conditions, or working conditions that might put you in the fetus, you now have a better right to refuse in these kinds of circumstances, no thank you. That when someone attacks you on the street, no thank you, that means that you have a better capacity to be able to take them to a court of law and say that you hurt my fetus as well. So this just misses the host of circumstances in which this policy will almost certainly apply, and will get all the benefits that we identified on our side of the house. So I think I've pretty conclusively proven to you that it is plausible that the majority of cases you will get assistance. Opening.
Sorry, just by your own logic then, why isn't going to get a checkup and your doctor being like, hey, it looks like you've been drinking, you're killing your baby, enough to stop the average mom from doing that, given that, as we told you, they probably care about the baby at the point which they've decided.
Because you tell us that they're addicted and you can't force them into rehabilitation without a criminal law or law that allows you to use the custodial powers of the state to put them into rehabilitation. So that is the part that you're missing. Furthermore, they tell you on back half that the harm that comes instead is that you get abortion. Two things I want to observe here. First of all, this is again a knife of open half, and open half says that the vast majority of mothers don't calculate this cost and don't think that they will ever get prosecuted. If that is the case, there's no good reason to get an abortion because you don't think you get detected. The second thing that I want to observe is that this is a massive cost for all the reasons that they identify. These are all good reasons why you would not want to abort your child. And I suspect that the vast majority of these mothers are caring about their child so much that they want to have that significant cost put onto that child. At least on the margins, there are certainly mothers who would choose not to abort and would instead choose to get help or have the custodial powers of the state used to help those people and ensure that there is recompense and compensation to prevent those harms. So I think this has benefit. No thank you. Second of all, how does this actually affect women's rights? I just want to briefly point out, as Kit notes, that a lot of the argumentation that comes out from the OO is a bit of a slippery slope. What they do say in the POI is that this creates common law precedent, which allows us to ensure that you can actually create changes. One, legislation is not binding in terms of precedent. When a law is created by a state, that is not part of the common law, that is legislation which is separate from the common law. That's the first thing to observe. I think it's important to note that in the UK there are already laws like this that exist. For instance, if a mother recklessly drives with a fetus in term and ends up causing an injury to that fetus in the long term, that is a regulatory problem that exists within legislation that does not create binding precedent. So this misses the way in which this law is created. But the second thing that I want to observe is that the signaling effect, no thank you, is one that is likely to cause a significant shift in their attitudes that will actually positively affect these kinds of notions, as Kit tells you, because the foundation of the right that this fetus has is not just independent but relational to that mother and their choice to have that child. So I think that this is a very important choice and not just a one-time choice like the closing opposition tries to characterize, and one which genuinely affirms a woman's ability to choose. At the very best, I think that this is an incredibly speculative argument, and it's unclear why this additional change would create enough fuel to change women's rights in a significant manner. Yeah,
both gov teams eventually accept that there will probably have to be punishments that apply much earlier than 20 years down the line. If you apply punishments like financial sanctions or removing children from families, is that not going to cause a massive amount of stress on those women and punish them in ways that could either harm the rearing of that child or cause massive emotional damage?
Okay, so I agree that financial sanctions and all these other things might have some harms, but I do want to note out that we have the ability to intervene at an early stage to try and protect these people, and that if we really do believe this, this does create a significant deterrent effect that I think is meaningful, which incentivizes these women to go to rehab, particularly because of the incentives that you note where these people love their children. The final thing that I want to talk about is whether or not fetuses have a legal claim to life. I think it's very important here, the nuance that we get from Kit, because the right that we identify is not the same right as OG. OG says that this right is independent, but what we tell you is that the right stems from the fact that you have made a commitment to that child that is almost contractual in nature, in the same way that when you choose to raise a child, you have special obligations to that child, even though no one in that society has obligations. That if you chose to give up that child to adoption, you lose those obligations, and anyone who chooses to have that child afterwards does gain special obligations. The point of this argument is that these obligations are relational, between an individual who makes a contractual promise to another person, and in this sense, you do make a genuine decision. The only push that we get from closing off is on culpability, but I think in the vast majority of circumstances, you do in fact know the fact that you were pregnant within those 3 months. That is not very plausible on their side of the house, and the situations that they talk about are marginal. So, what do we establish in this round? We prove to you that there is a definitive impact that occurs when you're able to intervene and able to deter women through the vast variety of mechanisms that we note on closing government, outfitting OG's lack of mechanism. That suggests that that is the most likely and plausible circumstance that will occur, meaning that you don't get the abortion, you don't get the lack of help, and you actually genuinely help fetuses who deserve a right to life. Thank you.
Okay, let's have the upward close out the debate. Check it.
Every government speaker in this round was extra concerned to have essentially the same introduction to ensure to everyone in this room that they really, really cared about women's rights. And it was super important to them that they protected women's choice. But apparently not ever enough for any of the Gov speakers to respond to any of the emotional damage or harm that is mentioned by the member of opposition, to ever concede that there might be massive, massive damage that is caused to the child, and especially to the mother in the cases in which these laws are implemented. That is a huge, huge problem for everyone on the government bench, and something that they should have done a better job of, especially in a round like this. Two themes in this speech. First, why might fetuses be harmed during pregnancy? And second, what pressures does this place on expectant mothers? Let's start with the question of why might fetuses be harmed during pregnancy. One of the most important claims on Gov's bench, and it's a fairly persuasive one, is this notion that fetuses are going to be harmed into the future, and that there's cascading damage that goes all along based on the decisions that women make at different parts of their pregnancy, right? We get the notion that there's going to be issues that could affect them later on in life, and that these individuals should have some level of protection from the actions that occur to them. I'm going to get into some of the structural arguments that are given by both us and by opening opposition to basically tackle that argumentation, but I want to talk about some other stuff here first. The really, really important thing that I want to note is that there are already tons of cases where in the status quo, where women have children in cases where they are likely to cause harm to children in significant ways. Ivy mentioned some of these, right? She uses the first example of the idea that if you are a single poor mother, you are less likely to be able to provide financial resources, access to healthcare, and all other kinds of things that would meaningfully harm the ability for a child to be able to live a better life. Not only that, my mother, my father, and basically everyone in my family has a basic guarantee that sometime after the age of 50 or 60, we're getting diabetes and we're having heart attacks. That's just something that's happening in my family. Everyone in my fucking family knows this. Excuse my language. This is a harm that I'm going to have to face. I never consented to this harm. Much in the way that all the government teams talk about how people don't get to consent to the idea that these harms could be caused. We allow women to still have children in these circumstances because we accept, as again Ivy mentions, that life is still worthwhile even if there are things that might happen to you that would impede that life in terms of specific damages, that you might not be as physically fit, that you could have other kinds of problem, because life is not simply about the structural disadvantages that you face individually. Parental love is a really, really key factor here, and we think that we're much better able to determine whether these women and these fathers are able to raise children after birth occurs through interventions like Child's Aid, and see if there is an effective trade-off in those circumstances. That's really, really important in this round. But that doesn't even get into the key question, right? Because all throughout the government bench, they just want to ignore these concerns of structural reasons why women might not be able to actually make these decisions. And the reason that you can know that they know that this is an issue is that the Prime Minister has this nebulous thing in their model about how they will account for mitigating circumstances somehow for when these kinds of cases are dealt with. But these mitigating circumstances are massive. We're talking about things like access to healthcare, access to information, access to work, structural factors that women cannot account for themselves. This is not just a second government paints it to be, where women don't know that they're pregnant. That is one example that Ivy uses. This is also situations where women don't have access to healthcare because they don't live close to hospitals, or they don't have money or insurance to be able to go to these places and be able to actually find out about their bodies. This is situations where women don't necessarily know exactly the nutritional ways that they need to be taking care of themselves, or what things might harm their bodies. I'd also suggest to you that there is some level of nebulousness in terms of what things, in terms of how much alcohol you can drink, might actually cause damage to a child. My guess is, well, maybe some people in this room will know it, but I would be surprised if everyone in this room had an exact number in their head about how many drinks a woman could have that would cause that level of harm. I think it's a little bit absurd for everyone outside government to assume this level of omniscient knowledge that women are always going to be culpable. And they try to get around this by saying, but hey, it only accounts for when it's intentional. But if this is the case, when is this ever actually going to be happening? Because we're never going to be able to have situations where we're actually going to be able to have any sort of resonance here. I'll take first half, I will get you guys later. And back
so I hate to ask this question like 5 times in the debate, but what is the meaningful distinction between this and policies that might also intersect with addiction, like for example feeding your kid alcohol or beating your kid when they're drunk, which apply to young children that are not fetuses?
So the difference is that like first of all, that this coerces women into making choices like having an abortion that you guys never deal with. And we agree that there are harms that are caused in this instance, but the difference between a young child is that there is a significant degree of more sentience than there is for a fetus that is literally conceded in the Prime Minister's speech early on. So I'd suggest that your answer is in your own speech at the beginning. Second theme about what pressures does this place on an expectant mother. And I'm not going to have to spend as much time on this theme, frankly, because Jason woefully fails to engage with it. So, what are we going to talk about? Coercion into unwanted abortions. Go ahead, Jason. I suppose you have some chance to respond. Yeah.
We hurt women too when we take away children and we coerce them through social services. That does not negate the fact that we have greater obligations to this child and that there's a commitment that is made that is relational, which means that there stems a degree of protection that we need to extend to these people regardless of the harms of both parties.
When we take a woman's children away from them, we do it in the most extreme circumstances. They do not understand the degree to which children's aid has to be certain that these parents are awful before they do that. And there is a very good reason for this. The reason that the government places extra care in taking this step is because it is terrible to have your child removed from you and to face that level of emotional harm. To have a being that you brought into the world that has an immense emotional connection to you literally ripped from you is a significant thing that happens that is much easier to determine after someone has been born than it is to do so beforehand. The second thing that's really important to know here is that Ivy mentions how this internalizes a lot of blame, where women end up making a single mistake and then worry about the potential consequences of this later. Note that when we talk about the idea that there's a big information asymmetry, this could lead to situations where women aren't even sure whether or not this harm might occur, because they don't know how their actions are actually going to materialize, and then might get abortions in these circumstances. Because we're talking specifically about women who would otherwise have brought their child to term, that's really, really harmful, because these women are not going to be responded to by first government by just saying, well, there's a difference between non-existence and the harm that happens after childbirth. The harm that we're talking about is the one that is done to the mother, when a mother is coerced by the government into doing something that she never would have done otherwise. At the end of this debate, I think it's really, really important to consider the damage that is done to the mother and the structural factors that lead women to do this. We will not suggest that all women are going to act in the most utilitarian ways, but we think it's reasonable to say that they will most of the time proud to oppose.